The billionaire who chose humanity. Imagine waking up in a world where your name opens every door, yet your heart feels locked away. Imagine having everything, power, wealth, and respect, and realizing one day that none of it ever truly made you rich. This is the story of Ethan Carter, a billionaire, who stepped down from his empire and walked into the streets as an ordinary man. He wasn't searching for fame nor redemption. He was searching for something far more precious, humanity. He learned what it meant to be ignored, to be spoken down to be invisible. He watched how society bowed to power, but turned its back on the powerless. And when he finally removed the mask of privilege, he discovered that the truest wealth was not in possessions, but in compassion. This story isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. About how quickly we forget the value of kindness in a world obsessed with success. About how easily we judge those who have less while celebrating those who take more. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this story is for you. If you've ever wondered whether goodness still matters in a world that rewards greed, this story will remind you that it does. Stay until the end, because what begins as a journey of disguise becomes a revelation that could change the way we see humanity itself. And if this message moves you, if you believe the world still has a chance to change, don't just watch. Be part of that change. Subscribe, share this story, and leave a comment saying what you would do if you were in Ethan's place. Because sometimes a story isn't just told to be heard, it's told to awaken hearts. This is more than a story about money. It's a story about meaning, and about one man who dared to lose everything just to remember what it means to be human. Part 1. The Billionaire's Disguise. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet city. Ethan Carter, one of the richest men in the country, sat alone by the window of his penthouse. The skyline shimmered in gold, yet his eyes were distant, lost in thought. He had everything: power, luxury, influence, but he felt an emptiness that his fortune could not fill. He often wondered if people cared for him or just for what he owned. One evening, he decided to find the answer. Without telling anyone, Ethan created a plan. He disguised himself as an ordinary worker, old jeans, worn shoes, and a faded shirt. He removed his watch, hid his car keys, and took a small bag with a few bills. For the first time in decades, he would live among those who had nothing. He wanted to see the world through their eyes. His first stop was a small neighborhood on the edge of the city. The streets were narrow and filled with people trying to make ends meet. A woman sold fruit by the road. A man repaired shoes. Children laughed as they played with broken toys. Ethan walked slowly, watching their faces, tired yet full of life. He found a small cafe that hired daily workers. The owner, a man named David, looked at him suspiciously. "You've got no experience, do you?" David asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, sir, but I'm willing to work hard." David sighed, but gave him a chance. "Clean the tables. Don't break anything." As Ethan began his first day, he noticed how differently people treated him. Customers ignored him. Some snapped their fingers for service, others made rude comments. He cleaned, served, and smiled. The work was tiring, but what hurt him most was the indifference. People didn't look at him, they looked through him. At night, Ethan returned to a cheap motel. The room was small and cold, with flickering lights and thin walls. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the world he used to see from above. There, people smiled at him because of his name. Here, they didn't even see him as human. Days passed. Ethan began to make friends with the workers. There was Maria, a single mother of two. James, a man saving every coin to treat his sick father. And old Henry, who had worked his whole life but still rented a small room. They had little, yet they shared everything: food, laughter, even tears. Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: connection. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, Maria asked, "You don't talk much, do you?" Ethan smiled softly. "I'm just listening. People here have stories worth hearing." She laughed. "Stories? We have too many, but nobody wants to listen." Later that night, Ethan watched as Henry gave his last piece of bread to a stray dog. The old man said, "He's hungry. I can eat tomorrow." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. The richest man in the city was learning the value of a simple act: kindness without reason. As the days went on, Ethan began to understand how the world treated those without power. They were judged not by their hearts, but by their wallets. He wrote down every experience in a small notebook, knowing it would change him forever. One evening, as he helped close the cafe, David told him, "You're a good worker, Ethan. Not many like you." Ethan smiled. For the first time, the compliment felt real. Outside, the night breeze touched his face. The city lights no longer looked golden. They looked fragile. He realized that money had built walls around him, keeping him apart from the beauty of simple humanity. Tomorrow, he decided, he would keep living as one of them and learn what wealth truly means. Part 2. Lessons from the Streets. The next morning, Ethan woke up before dawn. The room smelled of damp walls and old paint, but he didn't mind. He looked out the window and saw life beginning again. Street vendors preparing their carts, children walking to school with half-torn bags, and old men sitting quietly on the corner with cups of tea. It was a world he had never truly noticed before. He put on his worn shoes and went to the cafe. Maria was already there, setting the tables. She waved at him and handed him a cup of tea. "You'll need this today," she said with a tired smile. Ethan thanked her. The tea was weak, but it warmed him more than the expensive coffee he used to drink in his mansion. As customers arrived, Ethan noticed their behavior. Some people greeted the workers politely, but most didn't even acknowledge their presence. One man complained loudly about a missing napkin. Another scolded Maria for bringing his order late, though she had been serving 4 tables at once. Ethan wanted to speak up, but he stayed silent, observing. At lunch, David asked Ethan to deliver food to a construction site nearby. It was a hot day, and Ethan carried heavy trays under the sun. When he arrived, the workers were covered in dust, their faces tired but full of laughter. One of them shared his water with Ethan. "Drink, brother. You look exhausted," the man said. Ethan smiled, touched by the stranger's kindness. On his way back, he saw a small boy sitting near a trash bin, searching for leftover food. Ethan approached him gently. "Hey, are you hungry?" The boy nodded shyly. Ethan took him to the cafe and gave him some bread. David watched silently but didn't stop him. When the boy left, Maria whispered, "He comes here every day. His mother is sick." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, thinking about the inequality he had seen. He remembered meetings with other billionaires, where they spoke of profits and taxes, but never of people. He realized how blind he had been, how far his world was from the truth of everyday life. A few days later, he joined the workers for a small meal after work. They shared rice and vegetables on metal plates. Henry joked about his missing teeth. Maria laughed until she cried, and James told stories about his father's childhood. Ethan listened, feeling something strange, a deep peace he hadn't known before. For the first time in years, he was laughing. Not because of business success, but because he felt human again. The next morning, as they were cleaning the cafe, a rich customer entered. He wore a suit and a gold watch. He shouted at David, complaining about the noise, and the dirty smell of workers. Ethan froze. The man's arrogance reminded him of his former self. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "we're all just trying to work here. Please show some respect." The man turned red. "Who do you think you are?" he yelled. Ethan didn't answer. He simply bowed his head and returned to cleaning. After the man left, David whispered, "That was brave. But be careful. People like him have power." Ethan smiled sadly. Sometimes, power makes people forget what it means to be human. Later that day, Ethan walked through the marketplace. He saw people helping each other. One vendor lending another some coins, a woman feeding stray dogs, a man fixing an old lady's cart without asking for money. There, in the simplest moments, he saw the beauty of humanity that money could never buy. As he returned to his room, Ethan took out his notebook again. He wrote, "I once thought wealth was about owning things. But real wealth is about giving. The poor give even when they have nothing. The rich often give only when they have everything." He paused, then added another line. "Tomorrow, I'll learn what it means to truly share." Part 3. The Hidden Generosity. A week had passed since Ethan started living among the simple people. Once unfamiliar streets had now become a part of his routine. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise, walked through the narrow alleys, and greeted the vendors who knew him only as Ethan, the quiet worker. His hands, once soft from luxury, now carried the marks of labor, scratches, burns, and calluses. Yet, he found pride in them. At the cafe, things were busier than ever. Maria had fallen sick, so Ethan took on her extra shifts without saying a word. He cleaned, served, and washed dishes late into the night. When David tried to pay him more, Ethan refused. "Use it to buy medicine for Maria," he said. Softly, David stared at him, surprised. Few workers ever gave up money, especially when they needed it themselves. That night, Ethan visited Maria's small home. Her children were sleeping on the floor, their mother coughing softly. Ethan left a small bag of groceries by the door and walked away quietly. He didn't want thanks, only to help. In the silence of the dark streets, he felt something strange inside, a peace deeper than any luxury he had ever known. The next day, word spread around the cafe about the mysterious man who helped Maria. People began to notice Ethan more. Henry offered him a seat. During lunch, James brought him a homemade sandwich. They didn't know his past, but they sensed his kindness. One evening, as Ethan was cleaning the tables, a customer left without paying. David sighed. "It's not the first time," he muttered. Ethan took out some coins and placed them on the counter. "Take it," he said. David frowned. "You don't have to." "That's not your problem." Ethan smiled. "Maybe not, but it's our cafe." Days later, a storm hit the city. The cafe's roof began to leak. Everyone rushed to cover the tables with buckets and cloths. Ethan climbed up despite the rain, fixing the holes with whatever he could find. When he came down, he was soaked and shivering. Maria looked at him with concern. "You'll catch a cold," he laughed. "It's okay. I've faced worse weather." After closing, David pulled him aside. "Ethan, I don't know who you really are, but you're not like the others. Work as if this place belongs to you." Ethan looked at the floor. "Maybe I just want it to belong to everyone." That night, Ethan sat by the window of his motel. The rain had stopped, and the moonlight bathed the city in silver. He thought about the people he had met, the strength in their struggles, the grace in their giving. He realized that generosity wasn't measured by the amount given, but by the heart behind it. He opened his notebook again and wrote, "I once gave millions in donations that meant nothing to me. Today, I gave a loaf of bread, and it meant everything. The value of giving lies Not in the amount, but in the intention. The next morning, he found Maria back at work, pale but smiling. "I heard someone left food at my door," she said. Ethan looked away. "Maybe someone kind." She laughed softly. "Whoever it was, tell them I said thank you." My children slept with full stomachs. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt tears rise in his eyes. He turned away before she could see them. For a man who once owned skyscrapers, it was ironic that the greatest thing he had ever built was a moment of comfort for a mother and her children. As the day ended, Ethan made a silent promise. He would not leave this place until he had done something that would change their lives forever. The billionaire was no longer seeking meaning. He had found it in the hearts of the poor. Part 4. The Test of Character. Weeks had turned into a month, and Ethan had become part of the neighborhood. People greeted him warmly. Children ran up to him, and even David, who once doubted him, trusted him completely. Life among the simple had become his new reality. Yet one evening, life decided to test him in a way he never expected. A stranger entered the cafe just before closing. A young man in a fine suit, with polished shoes and a confident smile. He looked around, frowning at the warm furniture and the smell of cooking oil. "Is this the best cafe in this district?" he asked sarcastically. David, tired but polite, nodded. "We do our best, sir." The man sighed and sat down. "Bring me your finest coffee. And make it fast." Ethan served him quietly. As he placed the cup on the table, the man snapped, "Be careful. I don't want stains on my sleeve." Ethan stepped back, holding his calm. He had met hundreds like this before, people who measured others by clothes and status. But this time, it was different. He wasn't a billionaire defending his pride. He was a worker defending his dignity. The man took a sip and immediately spat it out. "This is terrible. Do you even know how to make coffee?" he shouted. Everyone in the cafe fell silent. David tried to apologize, but the man kept yelling, "I'll have this." Place shut down. People like you shouldn't even run a business. Ethan felt his hands tremble. For a moment, the old him wanted to rise. The man used to commanding, intimidating, and firing those who disrespected him. But he breathed deeply and said softly, "Sir, you're free to leave if you're not satisfied. No one forced you to come here." The man laughed cruelly. "Who do you think you are, a philosopher? You're just a servant." Ethan looked him straight in the eyes. "Then let this servant remind you that respect is not bought with money." The words silenced the entire room. The man glared at him, threw a few bills on the floor, and stormed out. David stood frozen. "Ethan, you shouldn't have said that. He might cause trouble." Ethan smiled faintly. "If speaking the truth causes trouble, then maybe the world needs more trouble." That night, rumors spread fast. The arrogant customer turned out to be the nephew of a wealthy business owner. By the next morning, inspectors came to the cafe, claiming they had received a complaint about hygiene and permits. David's face turned pale. "They could close us down," he whispered. Ethan knew this was his fault, or at least his responsibility. Without hesitation, Ethan met the inspectors. He greeted them respectfully and answered every question. He offered to help clean and organize the cafe to meet regulations. The men were surprised by his composure. One of them said quietly, "You care too much for a worker." Ethan smiled. "This place feeds families. It's worth caring for." By evening, the inspectors left with softened hearts. They issued a warning, but no closure. The cafe was safe, for now. David put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan replied. "Just promise me one thing. Never let fear make you bow to injustice." That night, Ethan returned to his room exhausted but proud. He wrote in his notebook again, When you have nothing to lose, you find the courage to stand for what's right. Money can buy comfort, but not integrity. Outside, the street lights flickered. The city continued its rhythm, unaware that one of its richest sons was sweeping floors and defending the dignity of the forgotten. Ethan realized something profound. The poor had something he had spent a lifetime chasing, strength built from struggle. He smiled to himself, whispering into the night, "Maybe this is the wealth I was always meant to find." Part 5, Seeds of Change. The morning after the inspection, the cafe was unusually quiet. The workers moved carefully, their minds still haunted by what could have happened. Ethan, however, felt a growing determination inside him. He had seen enough of suffering and injustice. It was time to do something meaningful, something lasting. He began observing everything more closely. How David struggled to pay rent for the cafe. How Maria often skipped meals to feed her children. How James was slowly losing hope of saving his father. Ethan realized that behind every smile was a hidden pain. He decided that if he truly wanted to understand humanity, he had to ease that pain. That evening, he visited a local stationery shop and bought several small notebooks. He called them Seeds of Change. In each one, he wrote a simple message: "Every good act you do today will bloom tomorrow." He left. Then secretly, one in Maria's bag, one on Henry's table, one behind the counter for David. Along with each notebook, he placed a few bills of money, carefully folded. It wasn't charity. It was faith, faith that these people would use it wisely. Days later, the results began to appear. Maria brought new shoes for her children. Henry repaired the cafe's old fan without asking for payment. David bought fresh paint to brighten the walls. The place started to feel alive, filled with colors, laughter, and hope. No one knew who had started it. Ethan just smiled quietly and kept working. One afternoon, a homeless man came into the cafe asking for water. Some customers frowned, but Ethan welcomed him with a gentle nod. He gave the man water and a plate of food. The stranger looked up with tears. "No one has treated me like this in years," he said. Ethan replied softly, "Then let this be the first of many times." The man smiled and left, whispering blessings as he walked out. Maria watched the scene and said, "You know, Ethan, sometimes I think you're not from here, the way you act. It's like you've seen the world from another side." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe I have. And maybe that side wasn't as bright as people think." That night, as he sat by his window, he thought about his mansion. The cold marble floors, the silent halls, the table set for 10, though he always dined alone. For the first time, he felt no desire to return. Here, among the humble, he had found what he had lost: belonging. A few days later, David gathered everyone after closing. He held one of the notebooks and said, "I don't know who left these, but they've changed everything. This cafe feels like a family now." Maria nodded, smiling. Maybe it was a sign from above. Ethan stayed silent, watching the joy around him. He didn't need recognition. Their happiness was his reward. That night, he wrote in his personal notebook, "Change doesn't begin with money. It begins with heart. You can plant a tree of kindness with nothing but your hands, and it will give shade to generations." The next morning, as sunlight entered through the window, Ethan made a quiet decision. He would reveal his true identity soon, not for pride, but to give these people a future beyond survival. They had given him humanity. Now he would give them opportunity. The seeds had been planted. It was time for them to bloom. Part 6. The revelation begins. A new month arrived, and with it came whispers of hope that spread through the neighborhood. The cafe, once dull and nearly empty, now attracted new faces every day. The air was lighter, the laughter louder, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the streets. Ethan worked quietly in the background, content to see others flourish. One morning, while cleaning the tables, David approached him. "Ethan," he said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about expanding the cafe. Maybe open another branch in the next district, but I don't have the money for it. I can barely keep up with the bills." Ethan smiled gently. "If you could open it, what would you do differently?" David paused. "I'd hire people like us, the ones nobody gives a chance to." Ethan's eyes softened. "Then maybe you should start planning." That night, Ethan wrote a letter under a false name and sent it to David, pretending it was from an anonymous investor who believed in his business. The letter included a bank transfer worth enough to start the second cafe. When David opened it the next morning, he almost collapsed from shock. Tears filled his eyes. "Who would do this for me?" Maria said, "Maybe it's destiny repaying your kindness." Ethan quietly kept sweeping the floor, hiding his smile. As days passed, things continued to change. Maria's children returned to school. Henry finally got new glasses. James's father received the treatment he needed. The cafe's walls, now freshly painted, reflected more than color. They reflected hope reborn. But even amid all this joy, Ethan began to feel restless. His time among them was coming to an end. The disguise that once freed him was now becoming a burden. Every day he had to lie about his past, and that lie began to weigh on his heart. One afternoon, while helping Maria carry boxes, she looked at him and said, "You've done more for this place than anyone, Ethan, but I feel like you're hiding something. You have this sadness in your eyes sometimes, like you belong somewhere else." Ethan froze. For a moment, he wanted to tell her everything. Who he was, where he came from, the billions in his name. But he smiled instead and said, "We all have stories, Maria. Some just take longer to tell." Later that evening, Ethan walked through the city center. For the first time in months, he approached his own corporate building. His name, Carter Enterprises, shone in golden letters across the glass tower. He stood there among the crowd, just another man in worn clothes. The guards didn't even recognize him. He watched his employees rush out, laughing, holding designer bags, talking about bonuses. It hit him deeply. The people working under his name lived in comfort, while others in the same city couldn't afford bread. The next morning, he decided to take one final step. He called his personal assistant from a public phone and said, "Cancel all meetings this week. I'll return soon, and there will be changes." The assistant, confused, asked, "Sir, are you all right?" Ethan replied calmly, "For the first time in years, I am." That night, as he lay in bed, his notebook rested on his chest. He wrote slowly, "The greatest disguise is not changing how you look. It's changing how you live. I entered this world as a stranger, and now it feels more like home than the palace I built. Tomorrow, I will tell them the truth." Part 7, The Truth Unveiled. The day of truth arrived. Ethan woke up before sunrise, his heart heavy but clear. He looked at the city skyline and knew that this would be the day everything changed, not just for him, but for the people who had unknowingly become his family. At the cafe, the morning rush had begun. Maria was serving customers, David was busy at the counter, and Henry was fixing a chair. Ethan walked in silently and began his usual tasks. But something in his expression was different, calm yet serious. After a few hours, David called for a short break. They all gathered near the small table where they usually shared lunch. Ethan looked around, his eyes filled with gratitude. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. Everyone went quiet. "My real name isn't Ethan Carter, the cafe worker," he said slowly. "It's Ethan Carter, the owner of Carter Enterprises." Maria blinked. Confused, David frowned. You mean the billionaire? Ethan nodded. The silence was deafening. James dropped the cup he was holding. It shattered on the floor, but no one moved. Maria's voice trembled. You lived with us? Worked beside us all this time? Why? Ethan's eyes softened, because I forgot what it meant to be human. I wanted to learn again, to see the world not through money, but through people. David looked hurt. You could have told us the truth. Ethan smiled sadly. Would you have treated me the same if I had? Maria lowered her gaze, realizing he was right. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside this envelope is a document. It declares you, David, as the new owner of this cafe. It's yours, legally and fully. And there's more. I've arranged funding for the second branch you dreamed about. David's eyes widened, tears streaming down his face. I can't accept this, he whispered. Ethan shook his head. You already earned it. This place became what it is because of you and your kindness. He turned to Maria next. There's a trust fund for your children's education. They'll never have to worry about the future. Again, Maria burst into tears. Why would you do this for us? Ethan placed his hand over hers. Because you did something for me that no one else ever did. You treated me like a person, not a name. Henry tried to speak, but his voice cracked. And me? Ethan smiled warmly. You once gave your bread to a stray dog when you had nothing left. I bought you a small home. It's waiting for you. No more rent, no more leaking roofs. The old man covered his face, sobbing silently. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was filled with emotion, gratitude, disbelief. Finally, David said, Ethan, you changed our lives. But what about you? What will you do now? Ethan looked out the window. I'll rebuild my company, not with walls and contracts, but with compassion. I want to create opportunities for people like you, people with heart. Maria wiped her tears and said, You didn't just find humanity, Ethan. You gave it back to us. The cafe filled with quiet applause. For once, there were no barriers between rich and poor, employer and worker, only people united by kindness. As the sun set, Ethan stood outside the cafe, watching the light reflect off its new sign. It no longer read just David's Cafe. Underneath, a small plaque read, Founded on Humanity. Ethan smiled softly, whispering, This is where wealth begins, in the heart. Part 8. Ripples of Compassion. The news of Ethan's revelation spread quietly but steadily throughout the city. People could hardly believe that the reclusive billionaire had been living among workers, cleaning floors, and serving tables. Some called him foolish, others called him noble, but those who knew him understood. He had changed because he had finally seen what wealth truly meant. The cafe, now renamed the Carter Foundation Cafe, became a symbol of unity. Doors stayed open to everyone, rich or poor, young or old. Those who couldn't pay still received food, and those who could often left generous tips for others. The simple act of kindness that began in one small corner had started to ripple across the city. Ethan returned to his office for the first time in months. His assistant, startled by his humble appearance, stood speechless. He smiled and said, It's still me, just lighter. Inside the conference room, his executives waited impatiently. They expected the same strict and distant man, but when Ethan entered, there was silence. He looked at each of them and said, We've been running this company like a machine. From now on, we'll run it like a heart. The executives exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan continued, Half of our profits will now go to community programs, education, food, shelter. We'll hire people who deserve chances, not just degrees. If anyone disagrees, You are free to leave. A few resigned. Most stayed, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Over the next few months, the company transformed. Factories adopted fair wages, local businesses received support, and hundreds of lives began to improve. Ethan visited the sites himself, not as a CEO, but as a friend. He shook hands with janitors, spoke to farmers, and played with children in orphanages. The media followed him everywhere, but he never sought attention. His message was simple: we rise by lifting others. Back at the cafe, David, Maria, and Henry watched the world change around them. Customers came from far away just to see where it all began. Journalists wanted interviews, but David always said, the story isn't about a billionaire. It's about the people who showed him what life is worth. One day, Ethan returned to visit. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, no guards, no assistants. Maria ran to hug him. Henry smiled with new glasses on, and David proudly showed him the new signboard. You did this, David said. Ethan shook his head. No, we did. I just had the money. You had the heart. They all sat together sharing tea, laughter, and stories. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like an outsider in either world, not the rich nor the poor. He was just human, surrounded by love and purpose. That night, as he walked back through the quiet streets, he saw the city differently. He no longer saw buildings and profits. He saw lives, dreams, and faces. He realized that true legacy isn't built in boardrooms. It's built in hearts. He took out his notebook one last time and wrote, "The greatest investment is compassion. It multiplies endlessly and never fades. When I was rich, I owned things. Now I belong to people, and that is worth more than all the gold in the world." Part 9. The Return of Greed. Months passed peacefully after Ethan's revelation. The city began to change, inspired by his message. Cafes, schools, and small businesses adopted his principles of compassion and fairness. The poor found opportunities, and the rich began to see generosity as strength rather than weakness. But as with every light, darkness soon followed. One morning, while reading a report in his office, Ethan's secretary knocked on the door. "Sir, there's a man here who claims to be your cousin." Ethan frowned. He hadn't heard from his extended family in years. "Send him in," he said calmly. The man who entered was sharply dressed, with an expensive watch and a confident smile. "Ethan, it's been too long," he said, stretching out his hand. "I'm Andrew. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you, the quiet one at family dinners." Ethan smiled politely. "Yes, I remember. What brings you here?" Andrew laughed. "Oh, nothing serious. Just thought we could reconnect. I've been running a few investment ventures. Quite successful, actually. I heard about your charity projects." He looked around the modest office, his tone dripping with subtle mockery. "You've really changed, cousin. Living like one of them, huh?" Ethan remained calm. "Yes, I've changed, and I'm grateful for it." Andrew leaned closer. "Listen, Ethan, I have a business proposal. You've got influence. I've got connections. Together, we could make millions. All I need is your name, just for credibility." Ethan studied him quietly. He could see through the polished charm. Greed had returned, this time wearing a familiar face. "I'm not interested in making millions anymore," Ethan said softly. "I'm interested in making a difference." Andrew smirked. "That's cute. But you can't feed the world with idealism. You need power, and power comes from wealth. Remember that." He stood up, straightening his jacket. "Think about it. You'll call me when you realize I'm right." Then he walked out, leaving behind the smell of expensive cologne and corruption. That evening, Ethan sat In his study, his mind heavy. He knew that the path he had chosen would always be tested. Greed, jealousy, and pride were old enemies of the soul. But he also knew that the world wouldn't change overnight. It would resist before it healed. Days later, strange things began happening. Anonymous articles appeared online accusing Ethan's foundation of fraud. People whispered that he had used charity to clean his image. Old business partners tried to distance themselves. Even the cafe faced inspections again, strangely similar to those from before. David called him, worried. "Ethan, what's going on?" "They say we're part of some money laundering scheme," Ethan sighed. "Calm down, David. I'll handle it." He knew immediately who was behind it. Andrew. The cousin had likely leaked false stories to pressure him into partnership. The world of business hadn't changed as much as he hoped. Rather than fight fire with fire, Ethan decided to stay true to his principles. He held a press conference, standing before cameras without a script. "I've been accused of many things," he said, his voice steady. "But I didn't come here to defend my name. I came to remind you that helping others will always attract doubt. But if fear stops us from doing good, then evil has already won." The room fell silent. Reporters, once skeptical, lowered their pens. His honesty was disarming. A few days later, evidence surfaced. Andrew's forged documents, fake witnesses, and manipulated records. The truth came out. Andrew was arrested for fraud, and Ethan was cleared. Yet, instead of celebrating, Ethan visited him in jail. Andrew looked up in disbelief. "You came here to mock me?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I came to forgive you. Greed doesn't make you evil. It makes you lost." Andrew scoffed, but his eyes betrayed guilt. As Ethan left the prison, he whispered to himself, "Every good act has its enemy, but goodness must persist." He realized then that his mission was far from over. The world would keep testing him, but his heart had already chosen its side. That night, he wrote once more in his notebook, "Even when betrayed, stay kind. The battle against greed isn't won by hate, but by mercy." He closed the book and smiled faintly. The storm had passed, but the lesson would remain forever. True wealth was not about never falling, but about standing again with compassion. Part 10. The Burden of Kindness. The scandal had passed, but something inside Ethan had changed. The attack from his cousin reminded him that goodness, when exposed to the world, often becomes a target. People doubted pure intentions because they had seen too many masks. He realized that carrying kindness was not easy. It was a burden that demanded patience and strength. In the following weeks, Ethan noticed that his employees treated him differently. Some looked at him with admiration, others with quiet suspicion. One afternoon, during a meeting, an executive said, "Sir, with all due respect, maybe your new policies are too generous. We're losing profit margins. We should think of shareholders." Ethan looked up slowly. "And who are the shareholders without the people who build this company?" The man fell silent. Ethan continued, "If generosity costs us comfort but saves someone's dignity, then that's not a loss. That's an investment." The meeting ended, but the tension lingered. Ethan felt the familiar isolation returning, the same feeling he had before leaving his mansion months ago. Back then, he was alone among wealth. Now he was alone among ideals. That night, he visited the cafe again. It was late, and only David remained, counting receipts. "You look tired," David said. Ethan smiled faintly. "I've been fighting a war no one can see." David nodded. "Doing good will always feel like that. But you taught us something. It's still worth fighting." They shared a quiet moment, both men understanding that kindness came with scars. The next day, Ethan received an invitation from a global conference on philanthropy. They wanted him to speak about his transformation. At first, he hesitated. He disliked attention, but then he thought of Maria, Henry, and David, the faces that gave his journey meaning. He agreed to go. When he walked onto the stage, the audience of dignitaries, journalists, and business leaders fell silent. Ethan began softly. I used to think wealth meant freedom, but I learned that freedom without purpose is emptiness. True wealth is not in possession, but in participation, in lifting others when they fall. He spoke about the cafe, about his disguise, about the people who unknowingly became his teachers. Many in the crowd wiped their eyes. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, not the kind that celebrates fame, but the kind that acknowledges truth. After the conference, a young journalist approached him backstage. Sir, how do you stay kind after being betrayed, mocked, and used? Ethan smiled gently. Because I remember the faces of those who believed when no one else did. Their kindness weighs more than the cruelty of others. But as he left the hall, he saw headlines already twisting his words. The Billionaire Saint, Carter's Redemption Tour, from Scandal to Savior. He sighed. Even when the message was pure, the world craved spectacle. His story, meant to inspire, was being turned into another product. That night, he sat in his hotel room, looking out at the glowing skyline. He opened his notebook and wrote, Kindness is not a story for headlines. It's a quiet act repeated by those who expect nothing in return. And sometimes, being kind means being misunderstood. He closed the book and turned off the light. In the darkness, he whispered to himself, If goodness is heavy, I'll carry it anyway, because the world becomes lighter when we share its weight. Part 11. The Shadow of Doubt. Weeks after the conference, Ethan found himself in a strange place emotionally. The world now praised him as a symbol of hope, yet he felt emptier than ever. Fame was never his goal, but it had followed him like a shadow, reshaping his intentions in the eyes of others. Every good act was now met with suspicion. Some said he was buying forgiveness. Others claimed it was all for attention. The weight of doubt began to sink into his heart. At Carter Enterprises, the change he had initiated started to slow. The board demanded results, numbers, and returns. One afternoon, an executive said bluntly, Sir, we respect your compassion, but charity doesn't pay the bills. We're losing investors. Ethan looked at the graphs on the screen, red arrows pointing down. He stayed silent for a long moment, then said, Maybe we should stop calling it charity and start calling it responsibility. The room went quiet. He dismissed the meeting and walked out. He went to the cafe that evening, needing to breathe. Maria and David were talking excitedly about a new literacy program they had started for local children. Ethan listened quietly, his heart warming again. It reminded him that the smallest changes often mattered more than the biggest donations. But just as hope began to return, another blow came. A former associate, jealous of Ethan's moral fame, began leaking false stories again, this time about embezzlement. In his foundation, the headlines spread like wildfire. Old allies turned distant, and even his company's stock began to fall. The same media that had once glorified him now questioned every motive. One reporter shouted at a press gathering, Mr. Carter, do you believe a man can truly change, or is this just another act? Ethan looked at the crowd and replied, A man can change, but it's the world that refuses to believe it. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the pain of honesty. Later that night, he sat alone in the cafe, long after closing. The lights were dim, and the rain outside tapped softly on the windows. David entered quietly and placed a cup of tea beside him. You look like a man who's fighting ghosts, he said. Ethan smiled faintly. I am. But they're not outside. They're inside me. Doubt is louder than truth sometimes. David sat down. Then let others doubt. You already know who you are. You proved it when you chose to be here with us. Those words struck deep. Ethan realized that he had allowed the world's perception to dictate his peace. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, remembering Maria's laughter, Henry's kindness, and the children's joy. That was real, not the headlines. The next morning, instead of going to his office, Ethan visited a school built through his foundation. The children greeted him with wide smiles. One little girl ran up and hugged his leg. "Thank you for my books," she said shyly. Ethan knelt and replied, "No, thank you for reminding me why we do this." The innocence in her eyes washed away every trace of doubt. That night, he opened his notebook once again and wrote, "Goodness will always be questioned, but a child's smile is proof that it's worth continuing. Let them doubt. We'll keep building." He closed the notebook and felt a strange calm return. For the first time in weeks, Ethan slept peacefully, knowing that his truth no longer needed to be proven. It just needed to be lived. Part 12. The Weight of Silence. Months passed since the storm of rumors faded, but something inside Ethan still lingered, a quiet heaviness that no amount of good deeds could erase. He had learned to stay calm when the world doubted him, but silence itself had become another challenge. After the noise of accusation, the stillness of peace felt strangely loud. At Carter Enterprises, his new systems of ethical business were working, slowly but steadily. Employees were happier, turnover had fallen, and the foundation's projects grew every week. Yet, Ethan felt a distance forming between him and the very world he had fought to change. People looked at him as a figure, not a person, a symbol of virtue instead of a man who still made mistakes. One evening, he was invited to a university lecture where young students wanted to hear his story. The auditorium was packed. When he stepped on stage, the applause was thunderous. He began, "I used to believe success was measured by numbers. Then I learned it's measured by the lives you touch." The students listened intently, but halfway through, he paused. Looking at their hopeful eyes, he said softly, "Don't make me your hero. Heroes stop you from believing in yourselves. Be better than me. Be kind without reason." The audience was silent for a long time before erupting in applause again. But Ethan didn't smile. The words had come from deep within, a truth he had only just realized. He had become a story, and stories could be misunderstood. Back at the cafe, Maria noticed his distant mood. "You're thinking too much again," she said. Ethan chuckled. "Maybe that's all I've ever done," Maria poured him a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You've done more than anyone I know, Ethan. Why do you still look so lonely?" He looked at her and said, "Because sometimes the louder your message becomes, the less you can hear your own heart." That night, he walked through the city streets. It had begun to rain lightly. The smell of wet earth and distant smoke filled the air. He stopped near a park where a group of homeless people huddled under a shelter. He walked over and quietly handed them blankets from the car he had borrowed. An old woman took his hand and whispered, "Bless you, son." Her voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. He realized he didn't need crowds or cameras. This was the world where his heart spoke clearly. Later, he returned home and stood before his mirror. The man staring back looked older, calmer, but somehow freer. He whispered to his reflection, "You've lost much, but you've gained yourself." It was the first time he truly meant it. The following morning, he met David at the cafe to discuss a new idea. What if we opened centers where people could learn skills, not just take charity? David's eyes lit up. "You mean help them stand on their own?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, I've given money long enough. It's time to give meaning. Together, they began drafting plans for what would become the Hands of Hope initiative. Weeks turned into months as they built the project. Dozens of people came, single mothers, young dreamers, elderly men who still had skills to teach. It became more than a school. It was a sanctuary for lost spirits. Watching them grow reignited Ethan's purpose. One afternoon, Maria said, "You know, Ethan, people come here not because of what you give, but because of how you make them feel seen." He smiled. "That's the only thing we all really want, isn't it? To be seen." That night, sitting by the window, he opened his notebook again. The world remembers the noise of success, but forgets the silence of growth. Do good quietly. It echoes longer. He placed the notebook on the table and looked outside. The city lights flickered, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel alone in the quiet. He had finally made peace with the silence. Part 13. The Fire Within. The Hands of Hope centers spread faster than anyone expected. Within a year, thousands of people had learned new skills, found jobs, and regained dignity. Ethan's vision was taking shape. But with every act of change came resistance, not from the poor, but from those who profited from keeping them that way. One morning, Ethan received a call from a partner organization. Their center had been vandalized overnight. Windows shattered, equipment destroyed, walls covered in hateful graffiti. When he arrived, he saw the workers sweeping broken glass, their eyes filled with fear. A local businessman who felt threatened by Ethan's influence had orchestrated the attack. Ethan looked around the wreckage, silent. Maria and David stood beside him. "What do we do now?" David asked quietly. Ethan's eyes hardened. "We rebuild, but not with anger, with purpose." That night, he called a meeting with volunteers from across the city. The hall was packed. Some were furious, others hopeless. Ethan stood before them and spoke calmly, his voice steady. "They can break our walls, but they can't break our will. Fire destroys only what it touches. Our fire is different. It gives light." His words echoed through the room. Slowly, applause grew, until the hall filled with a roar of determination. Over the next weeks, people worked day and night to rebuild the center. Donations poured in from strangers, inspired by his courage. The story reached international media again, and once more Ethan became a symbol, not of charity, but of resilience. But deep down, he knew symbols could fade. He wanted something permanent. He began planning a network of self-sustaining communities, where people could live, learn, and work together, without dependence on corporations or government. It was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but Ethan had stopped believing in limits. One evening, as he worked on the designs, David entered his office. "You're burning yourself out," he warned. Ethan smiled. "You can't light a fire without burning a little." Later that night, Maria visited him with food. She saw him staring at a drawing pinned on the wall, a circle representing unity. "You really think we can change the world?" she asked. Ethan turned to her. "We already are, one person at a time." The first self-sustaining community opened 6 months later. It had gardens, workshops, schools, and small homes built by the very people it would shelter. During the opening ceremony, Ethan stood before the crowd. "This isn't my dream," he said. "It's ours, a place where kindness feeds itself, a place where no one walks alone." Tears filled many eyes, including his own. But success came with new challenges. Political leaders began approaching him, some offering partnerships, others warning him to slow down. One minister said privately, "Mr. Carter, people like you disrupt balance. When the poor stop depending on us, we lose control." Ethan replied, Then maybe it's time the world finds a better balance. The minister frowned, realizing Ethan wouldn't be bought. That night, back at the cafe, Ethan told David, "Power fears what it cannot control. But that fear proves we're doing something right." David nodded. But his face was serious. "Be careful, Ethan. Some fires burn too bright." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then let it burn. Because if my fire dies, so does the hope we built." He turned to the window, watching the city lights shimmer like embers in the night. In his notebook, he later wrote, "The world will try to extinguish your flame when it starts to shine too far. But light exists to be seen, not hidden." Part 14. The Price of Light. As the first self-sustaining community thrived, the world began to take notice, and not all the attention was kind. Powerful figures, threatened by Ethan's growing influence, started to conspire quietly against him. He was no longer just a philanthropist. He was a reformer, a man rewriting the rules of wealth and dependence. That made him dangerous to those who benefited from imbalance. One morning, Ethan's assistant rushed into his office. "Sir, you need to see this." Handed him a newspaper. The headline read, "Carter's Empire Collapsing. Financial Misconduct Exposed." Beneath it were photos of him shaking hands with local officials, twisted into false accusations. His company's stock plummeted overnight. Sponsors withdrew. The very system he had once commanded was now devouring him. David called immediately. "Ethan, what's happening?" "People are scared. The centers might close." Ethan replied calmly, "Don't panic. The truth will stand when lies fall. Keep helping whoever you can." He hung up, but the pain was visible in his eyes. Within days, regulators froze. Parts of his assets. Former allies avoided his calls. Even some of the people he had helped began to doubt him. Maria arrived at his house with tears in her eyes. "Tell me this isn't true," she pleaded. Ethan gently took her hand. "If I had done anything wrong, I'd tell you. But sometimes doing right threatens those who live off wrong." They sat in silence for a while before Maria said, "You've given everything to this world. Why does it keep punishing you?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because truth burns before it shines." The following week, an official hearing was called. Cameras filled the courthouse. Ethan stood before a panel of judges and reporters wearing the same simple clothes he had worn during his time as a worker. When asked about the missing funds, he replied, "If generosity must be proven with balance sheets, then we have lost more than money. We have lost humanity." His words went viral. Millions watched as he spoke about transparency, greed, and the need for moral courage in business. Public opinion slowly began to shift. Investigators later discovered that forged documents had been planted to discredit him. The charges were dropped, and his name cleared. Yet the damage to his reputation lingered. That night, alone in his room, Ethan stared at his reflection. His hair was grayer, his eyes deeper. He whispered, "You wanted to light the world, and the world tried to blind you. But you're still standing." He turned to his notebook and wrote, "The brighter the light, the darker the shadows. It creates, but light must shine anyway. That's its nature." In the months that followed, Ethan scaled down his operations. He focused on smaller, community-based projects. He knew now that true change didn't need to be loud. It needed to last. The cafe became his informal office again, a humble space where new dreams were born daily. One evening, as he and David closed up, a stranger entered. The man was ragged, his clothes torn, but his eyes were sharp. "Are you Ethan Carter?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The man took a deep breath. "You don't know me, but years ago your foundation paid for my brother's surgery. He lived, and because of that, I live differently too. Thank you." Ethan smiled gently. "You owe me nothing." Just pass it forward." The man nodded and left, disappearing into the night. After he was gone, David said softly, "You see, even when the world tries to bury the truth, it grows back. Stronger." Ethan nodded. "Yes, David. Maybe that's the price of light, to burn, so others can see." He walked outside and looked at the stars above the quiet city. The same city that once ignored him now whispered his lessons through its streets. And though the battles had scarred him, his fire still burned, not for glory, but for grace. Part 15, The Fall and the Rise. Winter came, cold and relentless. Ethan spent more time at the cafe than in his office, surrounded by the familiar sounds of clinking cups and quiet laughter. The warmth of the place was a reminder that no amount of ice in the world could freeze the human spirit completely. Yet, even as peace lingered, a storm was forming again, this time inside him. The weight of years, the endless cycles of giving and rebuilding, began to wear him down. He was no longer the young visionary who had walked among workers in disguise. His back ached, his voice had softened, and sometimes his hands trembled. But his fire remained, even as his body protested. One morning, David noticed him staring blankly out the window. "You've been quiet lately," he said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Silence teaches better than speeches." David nodded, but frowned. "You're tired, Ethan. You need rest," Ethan chuckled. "Rest is for those who are done. I'm not done yet." That day, while visiting one of the Hands of Hope centers, Ethan collapsed mid-conversation. The workers rushed to help him. He awoke hours later in a hospital bed, pale and weak. The doctor entered with a concerned look. "Mr. Carter, your heart is strong, but it's overworked. You need to slow down." Ethan nodded, though his mind was elsewhere, on the people still waiting for help. Maria visited him with flowers. "You scared us," she said, holding his hand. Ethan smiled softly. "Maybe it's time." "I let others carry the torch." Maria's eyes glistened. "You already gave us the fire, Ethan. We'll keep it burning." After being discharged, Ethan stepped outside and took a deep breath of cold air. The city skyline shimmered in the distance. He realized that his life's work was no longer about him. It had become something larger, self-sustaining. The seeds he planted had grown roots too deep to die. Weeks later, David organized a gathering at the cafe. The place was overflowing. Former workers, students, families, and strangers whose lives Ethan had touched. When he entered, the crowd rose in applause. Maria handed him a framed photograph, the original team from the cafe's first days. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "Asterisk for the man who reminded us that kindness is wealth." Asterisk. Ethan tried to speak, but his voice broke. "I don't deserve this," he said. David replied, "You don't have to deserve kindness to give it. That's what you taught us." In that moment, Ethan felt something shift. The burden he had carried for years seemed lighter. The movement he had started now belonged to everyone. He was no longer its leader. He was its witness. That night, he sat by his window once more, watching the city lights. In his notebook, he wrote, "I once feared the world would forget me. Now I hope it does, as long as it remembers the message. Let others take the stage. My part is done." The next morning, he walked through the park, greeting the homeless man he always helped, smiling at the children running to school. He felt peace, the rare kind that comes not from victory, but from surrender. Ethan Carter, once a man defined by fortune, had finally found his wealth in quiet anonymity. As he reached the cafe, the sign above glowed softly in the morning light. Asterisk, founded on humanity. Asterisk. He touched the letters with his fingers and whispered, "You can fall 1,000 times and still rise as long as your reason is love." Part 16. the echo of goodness. Spring returned, painting the city in colors that felt alive again. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to slow down. He spent mornings walking through the gardens of the Hands of Hope community, listening to laughter, watching life flourish. The projects no longer needed his constant presence. They had grown roots, strong, independent, and full of purpose. It was what he had always wanted, to make himself unnecessary. One day, while sitting under a blooming tree, a group of children surrounded him. One boy, no older than 10, held a notebook similar to the one Ethan always carried. "Sir," the boy said shyly, "my teacher told us that you're the man who built this place. Is that true?" Ethan smiled. "I only helped. The real builders are people like your teacher and you." The boy grinned. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Ethan's eyes softened. "Then promise me one thing. When you grow up, be kind even when it's not easy." The boy nodded seriously. As the children ran off, Maria approached, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat beside him. "They adore you," she said. Ethan chuckled. "That's dangerous. They should adore themselves for what they can do." Maria smiled. "You'll never stop teaching, will you?" He shook his head. "Teaching is just reminding people of what they already know in their hearts." In the following weeks, Ethan received letters from all over the world, people who had read about his journey and started projects of their own. From villages in Africa to cities in Europe, from small towns in South America to rural schools in Asia, the echo of his message traveled far. He realized that goodness had no borders. It moved silently, carried by hearts rather than headlines. One afternoon, a young woman came to meet him. She introduced herself as a journalist who had once written negative articles about him during his scandals. "I came to apologize," she said, nervous. Ethan smiled gently. "You don't need to. The truth always takes longer to arrive, but it always does." She looked emotional. "Your story changed my life. I quit my job and started working for a non-profit." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "And that means it was worth it. We can't control what happens to us, only what we do with it." Later, during a quiet evening, David joined Ethan on the cafe terrace. The sun was setting, bathing everything in orange light. "Do you ever wonder what the world will remember about you?" David asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "Maybe nothing. And that's fine. If they remember hope, that's enough." A gentle wind carried the smell of fresh bread from the cafe. The laughter of families filled the air. For Ethan, these simple sounds were proof that humanity was healing. He no longer needed validation or applause. The echo of goodness spoke for itself. That night, he opened his old notebook. Most pages were full, but he found one blank. With steady hands, he wrote, "Goodness does not end when we stop giving. It begins when others start passing it forward. I may fade, but kindness will echo forever." He closed the notebook and placed it on his knitstand. The next morning, he visited the community. One last time before a short retreat he planned in the countryside. As he walked through the gates, people stopped to greet him. Farmers, teachers, children. Each smile felt like a reflection of his soul. He realized then that legacy was not something you leave behind. It was something you plant in people while you're still here. And in that realization, Ethan Carter, once a billionaire, later a servant, found the peace he had chased his entire life. Part 17, The Final Gift. Ethan's retreat in the countryside was meant to be temporary, a time to rest, reflect, and reconnect with nature. Cottage he rented sat near a lake, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of birds. For the first time in years, he woke without schedules, meetings, or calls. The silence was complete, but it was not empty. It was full of peace. He spent his mornings walking along the shore, watching the sunrise shimmer on the water. Sometimes he would write in his notebook, but more often he simply sat and listened to the wind, to the earth, to the quiet heartbeat of life itself. He realized that everything he had chased, success, meaning, redemption, had led him to this, stillness. One afternoon, Maria and David came to visit. They brought food, laughter, and news from the city. "The new centers are doing well," David said proudly. "Your ideas are spreading faster than we can manage." Ethan smiled. "Then it's no longer my dream. It's everyone's." Maria handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of children holding signs that read, "Thank you for teaching us to believe." Tears filled his eyes. "They're the ones who'll change the world," he whispered. As the evening fell, the three of them sat by a small fire. The air smelled of pine and smoke. "You know," Maria said softly, "when I met you, I thought you were just another quiet man looking for work." Ethan laughed. "And I was, except I didn't know I'd find my purpose there," David added. "You didn't just change lives, Ethan. You built a new way of living." Ethan gazed at the fire. "Then promise me something. Keep building, even when I'm gone." They both nodded silently. That night, after they left, Ethan sat by the lake under a sky full of stars. The moonlight reflected off the water like liquid silver. He took out his notebook, the same one he had carried since the beginning, and flipped through the pages filled with lessons, drawings, and memories. On the last page, he wrote slowly, his handwriting trembling slightly, "To live is to give. To give is to live forever." He closed the book, placed it beside him, and looked up at the stars. The wind brushed through the trees like a gentle voice. He whispered, "Thank you for everything." And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to do more, to prove more, or to change more. He had completed the circle. The next morning, the caretaker found Ethan sitting by the lake, eyes closed, a peaceful smile on his face, the notebook resting on his lap. The sun had risen, painting the world gold. He was gone, but not lost. The echo of his kindness still lingered in the air. When news of his passing reached the city, thousands gathered outside the cafe and the Hands of Hope centers. Maria and David stood before the crowd, holding the notebook like a relic. David spoke through tears. "He didn't leave us money. He left us meaning." Maria added, "He taught us that the greatest gift is not what you give to the world, but what you awaken in it." The centers continued to grow, fueled by the people Ethan had inspired. Years later, children who had once learned under his programs became teachers, leaders and dreamers who carried forward his legacy. And though his name faded from headlines, his message never did. At the cafe, a single chair by the window remained empty, Ethan's chair. On the wall above, it hung his final words, framed and simple. "True wealth is not in what you own, but in what you leave within others." And in the quiet moments of the city's nights, when the wind moved softly through the streets, it almost sounded like a whisper, a reminder that one man's goodness can live forever in the hearts he touched.